Welcome back. Now that we've looked at the muscle contraction and what's going on in the actual contraction itself, and we saw that we needed energy in pretty good quantity in order to keep that muscle contracting, we'll take a quick look at the muscle metabolism now. So ATP is the energy that we need. We need ATP in order to fuel our cell. And we have a few different ways that we can get the muscle, kind of depending upon the length of time that the muscle is going to be used. And so when we first start to contract a muscle, the first couple of seconds is essentially going to be almost like a startle to the cell or to the entire system itself, in that we don't really have an increase in blood supply or an increase in oxygen or glucose supply to the cell. So we're going to have to be able to get ATP from a couple of different sources. And so one way is that we can, in a sense, already have ATP inside the muscle. That ATP is there, it's ready, it's available, and we can start to use that right away. But there's not a ton of it there in the cell. We have a way that we can keep some of our ATP inside the cell as well for ready use, in that we can have it stored away as creatine phosphate. And so whenever we have excess amounts of ATP, we're going to take and combine that ATP and take off one of its phosphate groups and give it to a creatine. So we're going to basically do this in reverse on there. So now that we have creatine phosphate stored, we can take and break it down and take our creatine phosphate, take off that phosphate group, transfer it over to an ADP. We've not destroyed the energy, we've not changed the energy in any way, but now we have our ATP ready for the cell to use. Another way is that we can take ADP and take more of them. So we may even have leftover ADP over here that we can bring. We have some ADP over here that we can bring to the table. And we're going to combine two ADPs to get us one ATP, and then we're going to be left with an AMP. So we have 3 over here for the ATP for triphosphate, plus our 1 in our monophosphate, and so we have our 4 still. And so the energy was conserved, and now we have ATP once again. But all these processes aren't going to get us a vast quantity of ATP for the cell to use. And so the best way for us to get ATP is to go through aerobic cellular respiration. So we're going to go through this process of getting us our ATP, much like we talked about back in cells. And so glucose, which we have inside the blood, and so it may be stored inside the blood, it may be even in the muscle cell itself as glycogen. We can do this in one of two processes. And so we can either take blood glucose and break it down and go through the process of glycolysis and stop there, and we get 2 ATP. Still better than the 3 former ways because we only got 1 ATP. So we just doubled the amount of ATP that we got. But again, this still isn't going to be enough. This isn't going to be enough to power that cell. So instead of just stopping here at 2 ATP, we're going to go and run through the citric acid cycle and our electron transport chain, and we're going to end up with upwards of 34 more. So we end up with a total of 36 ATP from our single glucose. So that one glucose turns into 36 ATP, as long as we have plenty of oxygen. We need to have oxygen available for this process to occur. So we need to have lots and lots of energy. This can supply the muscle essentially indefinitely. As long as it's not doing strenuous exercises, things like that, we have the ability to continue on that way. Again, in those first few seconds of the muscle contracting, we're going to use, again, anaerobic processes. Aerobic processes will still be functioning, they'll still be going on, but that's what we're going to utilize in a sense to power the muscle over the long term. This is going to get us our long-term supply. We can walk for hours and hours and hours just simply by using aerobic cellular respiration. If we run out of any of our components, so things like glucose or oxygen, then we're not going to be able to make all of that ATP that we need. But blood glucose levels themselves will begin to drop. And so we're going to have to go to where we have storage of glucose. And we store glucose away as glycogen. And so some of the places where we store glycogen are places like the liver and in muscle. And so we have muscle glycogen. We can break down that glycogen into all of its glucose, and that can then be released directly into the muscle. Or if it's from the liver, then it's going to come and bring it in from the liver. So now if we're still working our muscles, and essentially our muscles run out of glycogen, our liver runs out of glycogen, now we're going to start to move over towards fats. And so fats themselves that are stored away can be converted back to glucose. They may have started as glucose in the first place, or maybe they were just lipids in the first place. But we can take that glucose and start to convert it, or the lipids, and start to convert it back over into glucose. This process itself requires a large amount of oxygen. We have to have an abundant amount of oxygen in order to break down our fatty acids and get us back to a glucose starting point. So this is going to be very aerobic in its process. But as long as we're keeping the muscle well supplied with oxygen, keeping it well supplied with ATP, it can keep on going. So for aerobic exercise, the key here is that we have oxygen. And so oxygen levels in the muscle need to be maintained. And so as we start to use a muscle, that muscle's blood supply is going to increase. And so heart rate may go up, respiratory rate may go up. And this is then going to allow for an increase in blood flow to the muscle. And so you may have experienced this in the past, where as you start to use a muscle, the area around that muscle starts to become a little bit redder. It starts to look like it's increasing in blood flow, and some of that's designed to get rid of heat and things like that as well. But it's also because we're using that muscle. And so as we generate that muscle contraction, heat's going to be given off, and that's going to also increase blood flow into the area as well. So blood glucose levels are good, aerobic cellular respiration. Oxygen levels are good, aerobic cellular respiration. And we're going to end up with plenty of ATP to power that muscle. We're going to have plenty for the actual contraction. We're going to have plenty for calcium pumps. We're going to have lots of energy there. And we can go running or walking or biking and swimming. All of those kind of aerobic types of exercises, we can do them for a long, long period of time. Anaerobic is more of the use it and then rest. And so this is more like lifting weights, things like that. And so anaerobic cellular respiration, we're not going to have the oxygen there. We still get our glucose, and we're going to get that from any number of sources once again. But if those oxygen levels are low in the muscle, we're then going to generate our ATP, but we're also going to get a relatively, in a sense, bad byproduct. And that byproduct is lactate. Lactate, when left in the muscle for too long, gets converted into lactic acid. And so it's going to convert into lactic acid. That lactic acid sitting in the muscle is going to cause that burning sensation that you feel in the muscle when, in a sense, you've used it for too long in an anaerobic state. And so the muscle is no longer able to keep on working. We experience this in specific muscles as well that are basically designed for kind of power movements. And so things like our deltoid muscle, our shoulder muscle there, if we're trying to raise our hand and ask a question, our deltoid quickly starts to fatigue. It's not meant to be working for long, long periods of time. It's give that big, powerful contraction and then let it rest. Give that big, powerful contraction and let it rest. And so in other muscles even, we're going to do the same thing as long as we have that big, powerful motion. It's going to be done in an anaerobic state. So we're not going to be able to keep it up for very long. Different muscles are designed for different processes. I just alluded to this a moment ago when I said that things like the deltoid is meant to kind of work and then rest. And so those types of muscles, in terms of the deltoid, these have a type of muscle cell that are fast glycolytic fibers. And so they have a preponderance of fast glycolytic fibers. They're meant for short, intense, strong, powerful activities. Things like powerlifting, things like lifting weights, lots of weight, relatively little reps, because that one repetition is going to cause relatively large amounts of fatigue in the muscle itself. But not all our muscles are filled with fast glycolytic fibers. Other muscles have slow oxidative fibers. And so slow oxidative fibers are designed for kind of use all day long. These are things not just for like running a marathon, but also muscles like postural muscles. And so posture, we need to have those muscles work all day long. And so those muscles need to have endurance to them in order to keep your head above your shoulders without it flopping all around everywhere. We need to have those slow oxidative fibers there to help us out. Kind of our long duration types of muscles that allow us to work at a little bit more intensity are our fast oxidative fibers. These fast oxidative fibers allow us to go at a little bit faster pace with still the endurance that is there. And so this may be things like walking, or rather than sprinting, this is more like going for a jog. This is things that are allowing us to use that muscle for a kind of a longer period of time. Lifting more low weights for higher repetition. This is going to be those fast oxidative types of fibers. In any given muscle, we're going to have essentially a combination of the three. And so the combination of the three that is there is going to give us the overall kind of appearance to a muscle itself. And we've all seen this before, that different muscles look different when we look at them from the outside. And kind of the easiest one to look at is something like chicken or turkey. And so with chicken or turkey, we have light meat and we have dark meat. And so we have things like the chicken breast, which is just simply pectoralis major, and we have that muscle there versus, say, thigh muscles, where we've now got our hamstrings and our quadriceps, and the two look very, very different. The breast meat is more part of the fast glycolytic types of fibers. We're going to use it and then we're going to let it relax. We then have kind of our thigh muscles, and they're going to be more of a combination of our fast oxidative and our slow oxidative types of fibers. Somewhere in between. They're meant to work kind of all day long. So we're going to see that difference in there. And we can see that the muscle fibers look redder, they look darker. Those individual cells have more myoglobin in it. They have more mitochondria in them. The muscle itself in general is going to have more blood supply to it, so it's going to have a lot more blood vessels and capillaries running through it to be able to power that muscle over the long haul. And here we have just kind of a chart describing the types of fibers themselves, along with kind of the characteristics that go along with each one. And so we can see that there's quite a bit of a difference in the types that are there for the different types that we just saw. So when muscles are working and we're using them over and over and over again, they start to hypertrophy. And so as we go to the gym and we work out and we do things to allow our muscles to become fatigued, that's going to allow the muscles to start to increase in size. And their size increases due to the fact that we put more myofibrils in there. Those more myofibrils have more myofilaments. In order to power those cells, we're going to need to have more mitochondria and potentially more stores of glycogen. The thing that we don't have is more cells. We don't increase the numbers of cells, we just simply increase the numbers of proteins that are inside the cell. And so this is where we go to the gym, we lift that high weight, low rep type of situation, or at least if we're doing high rep, lower weight, we're increasing the weight incrementally over time. And so we're increasing more and more of those fibers that are there. And that gets us this hypertrophy of the muscles. It becomes larger, it becomes stronger. Atrophy of muscles occurs with just the opposite. Atrophy of muscle comes in essentially two processes. in general in the younger adult, we either have disuse atrophy or we have denervation atrophy. And so disuse atrophy would be reduced use. This could be because we have a fracture and that part of the limb is in a cast. So if you ever had a cast for any period of time, 4 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever it happens to be, you know that your cast got essentially looser as time went by. And it got looser and looser. In the beginning, at least, it was perhaps looser because a lot of the swelling went away. But later on, a lot of that decrease in the amount of size there is because the muscle is actually atrophying. Paralysis or denervation atrophy, this comes from causing some sort of problem to the nerve that supplies the muscle. And that's what we have over here in this hand. You can see that this part of the hand into the palm, we can see in between the tendons. All of those areas are sunken in and reduced, and that's because the nerve that supplies the hand here, the median nerve, normally comes out and supplies and splits and kind of does these areas here in there. It has become damaged or blocked right here in the wrist. And this is what carpal tunnel syndrome is. And so carpal tunnel syndrome not only affects numbness and tingling in the fingers, but it also affects muscle contraction, weakness in grip, and that decreases over time. So if that damage to the nerve is continuing on, it eventually is going to lead to denervation atrophy of the muscles in the hand, and that's going to eventually lead to essentially paralysis eventually of the muscles if it's not fixed at all. If left long enough, these muscles here that have been damaged won't even come back. So they're not going to increase in their size even if the carpal tunnel is released. And so that can cause the muscles themselves to actually literally die off. And then they're going to turn into something like with normal aging, where the function of the muscles decreases over time. So the same thing can happen in the short term at times with things like botulinum toxin or with tetanus, in that we can alter how the muscle is actually able to be supplied by the stimulus that it needs for contraction. That's there. And so botulinum toxin affects the binding of neurotransmitter to the actual muscle receptors. Myasthenia gravis destroys those muscle receptors. And so effectively, even though this nerve may be telling the muscle contract, 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 it never gets the signal. Tetanus is just the opposite in that it turns off muscle inhibition. So muscles get tighter and tighter and tighter and more contracted as that toxin continues to be in the bloodstream. From there we have things like polio. Polio affects the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord, and so it's going to destroy the lower motor neurons so that they can no longer send the signal. So we stop it way back up in the cell body, and the signal never even gets to the muscle, again causing a denervation type of an atrophy in the muscles. From here, we'll continue on to look at the muscle and the physiology of them.